Cast your mind back to 1944. The world, quite literally, was engulfed in flames. Millions were perishing in the deadliest conflict humanity had ever witnessed. Cities lay devastated, reduced to rubble by relentless bombing campaigns. Empires were crumbling, their long-held power dissolving. Yet, amidst this global turmoil, in the serene setting of a quiet mountain resort in New Hampshire, 44 nations convened. Their purpose? To forge a decision that would fundamentally reshape the global economy for the next 8 decades. Remarkably, this pivotal gathering remains largely unknown to the general public. Yet, its ramifications are profound. It laid the very foundation for the dollar's global supremacy and cemented America's ascendancy as the preeminent financial superpower. Intriguingly, it's also argued to be the underlying reason why you, perhaps, find yourself less affluent than your grandparents, despite often toiling twice as hard. For in July 1944, within the hallowed halls of a hotel then known as Bretton Woods, the most influential figures on Earth sat down to determine the future mechanics of money, not merely for their own respective countries, but, in essence, for everyone, forevermore. What they devised was a sophisticated system, meticulously engineered to guarantee American economic dominance, effectively locking other nations into a state of perpetual dependency. This financial architecture, forged in those 3 weeks, continues to exert its influence, arguably bleeding you dry, even in the present day. This was no conference about fostering peace or championing freedom. It was, unequivocally, about power. And the profound decisions reached during those 3 weeks have indelibly shaped your entire economic reality. Every pound you earn, every price you pay, every debt you carry, all can ultimately be traced back to Bretton Woods. Should you truly grasp the events that transpired in that room, you will undoubtedly understand why the system often feels inherently rigged. Because, quite simply, it is, and it was explicitly designed that way from its very inception. Let us set the scene. It is July 1944. World War II continues to rage across continents, but the ultimate outcome is no longer in doubt. The Allied forces are inexorably winning. Nazi Germany is predicted to fall within a year, with Imperial Japan soon to follow, a reality well understood by those in command. Thus, even as soldiers continued to make the ultimate sacrifice on distant beaches and in dense jungles, diplomats and economists were already meticulously planning the contours of the post-war world. The momentous meeting took place at the Mount Washington Hotel, nestled within Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. A staggering 730 delegates, representing 44 diverse countries, gathered there. For 3 intensive weeks, they engaged in fervent debate, heated arguments, and complex negotiations, all aimed at defining the future of global finance. The official, publicly stated goal was to construct a system robust enough to prevent the kind of economic chaos that had catastrophically led to the Great Depression and subsequently, World War II. However, the true, unspoken objective was to determine precisely who would control the world's money supply. And America, being the sole major economy that had not been bombed into ruins, the only nation with its vast industrial capacity still entirely intact, and the single power holding the lion's share of the world's gold reserves, fully intended to emerge victorious. Leading the American delegation was Harry Dexter White, a brilliant but ruthless economist from the U.S. Treasury Department, absolutely unwavering in his commitment to American dominance. Facing him across the negotiating table was John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most celebrated economist in the world at the time, representing a beleaguered Great Britain. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods with the stark realization that Britain's era as a financial superpower was drawing to a close. The relentless demands of the war had utterly bankrupted the British Empire. London, once the undisputed epicenter of global finance, found itself buried under mountains of debt. The pound sterling, which had presided over international trade for 2 centuries, was now in its death throes. Keynes, ever the visionary, proposed the creation of a brand new global currency, something truly neutral, not subject to the control or whims of any single nation. He suggested naming it the Bancor. This innovative currency would be issued by a newly established world central bank, and every country would settle its international trade in Bancors, rather than in dollars, pounds, or francs. In theory, it was a brilliant concept, a currency that would belong to everyone, and yet to no one. However, Harry Dexter White swiftly and decisively crushed this idea. America, after all, did not seek a neutral system. America desired an American system, and crucially, America possessed the overwhelming leverage required to achieve it. By 1944, the United States held an astonishing 2/3 of the world's monetary gold. This was not simply because they had mined it all, but rather because throughout the war, virtually every nation that desperately needed weapons, vital foodstuffs, or essential supplies had paid America in gold. Britain, for instance, had systematically drained its precious reserves to purchase American weaponry. France had shipped its gold across the Atlantic to New York for safekeeping. Even the Soviet Union, despite its status as an ally, had paid in gold for American trucks and tanks. The gold flowed relentlessly westward, accumulating in colossal piles within vaults beneath Manhattan and deep inside Fort Knox. America had not merely triumphed militarily in the war, it had achieved an unparalleled economic victory. And at Bretton Woods, that vast hoard of gold transformed into a potent weapon in its arsenal. Here, then, is the deal that was ultimately struck. The US dollar would be formally designated as the world's primary reserve currency. Every other national currency would be fixed, or pegged, to the dollar at a predetermined, stable exchange rate. The dollar itself, in turn, would be pegged to gold, at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Crucially, if you were a foreign government holding US dollars, you retained the right to redeem those dollars for actual gold whenever you wished. This was the fundamental linchpin of the entire system. Other countries agreed to utilize dollars because they firmly believed those dollars were, indeed, as good as gold. America solemnly promised that for every dollar circulating internationally, there existed a corresponding quantity of gold in Fort Knox to back it up. It sounded eminently fair. It promised stability. But, as history would reveal, it was a carefully laid trap. While other nations were compelled to maintain strict financial discipline, balance their budgets, and constantly worry about their currency losing value, America possessed the unique ability to print dollars, safe in the knowledge that the entire world would accept them as if they were gold. And for 27 years, that is precisely what America did. Print and spend. Print and spend. This was possible because the rest of the world desperately needed dollars for international trade, needed dollars to rebuild their shattered economies, and crucially, needed dollars to purchase oil, which had now become exclusively priced in U.S. currency. The entire burgeoning global system operated on American currency, and America, of course, controlled the printing press. Two immensely influential institutions were also forged at Bretton Woods, both of which continue to dominate global finance to this very day: the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. The IMF was conceived to manage the new currency system, ensuring that countries maintained stable exchange rates and honored their international debts. The World Bank, conversely, was intended to finance the massive reconstruction efforts in war-torn Europe and to support development in poorer nations. Both organizations were strategically headquartered in Washington, D.C. Both were controlled, by virtue of weighted voting power, by America, and both swiftly evolved into powerful instruments of American foreign policy. If a country sought a loan from the IMF, it invariably had to acquiesce to American terms: open your markets, drastically cut government spending, privatize your state industries, and allow American corporations unfettered access. Refusal meant isolation. You were frozen out of the global financial system. Your currency would collapse, your economy would crater, and eventually, you would return, desperate, forced to accept whatever stringent terms were offered. This was the true genius of Bretton Woods. America did not need to physically invade countries to control them. It simply needed to control their access to money. Britain, naturally, fought against this impending subjugation. Keynes argued passionately for a more balanced and equitable system. Yet, Britain possessed virtually no leverage. The war had utterly decimated its economy, leaving it owing billions to America. Its vast empire was rapidly disintegrating. India would achieve independence in 1947, with African nations soon to follow. The pound, once the undisputed backbone of global trade, was now merely another currency struggling desperately to stay afloat. Keynes departed Bretton Woods exhausted and profoundly defeated. He passed away just 2 years later, in 1946, knowing that the world he had striven to save had been irrevocably reshaped in America's dominant image. The other nations, too, had little choice. Europe lay in ruins. Japan was under Allied occupation. The Soviet Union, despite its formidable military might, was economically shattered. China was embroiled in a brutal civil war. Every single country required dollars to rebuild, and the only viable ways to acquire those dollars were to sell goods to America or borrow from American banks. The system, it was clear, had been rigged from day one. But it was the only system on offer. So, reluctantly, they signed on. Here, then, is what Bretton Woods truly accomplished. It placed the US dollar squarely at the epicenter of the global economy. Every international trade, every significant transaction, every single barrel of oil, all had to pass through dollars. If Japan wished to purchase oil from Saudi Arabia, it first needed dollars. If Germany intended to trade with Brazil, it required dollars. Even if two countries had absolutely no direct dealings with America, they still needed American currency to conduct their business. This ingenious arrangement created an insatiable, perpetual global demand for dollars. And America, as the only country capable of printing these universally desired dollars, effectively became the banker to the entire world. However, a fundamental problem eventually emerged. To adequately supply the world with enough dollars to function smoothly, America had to consistently run trade deficits. It had to import significantly more than it exported. It had to send vast quantities of dollars overseas. This seemingly innocuous requirement meant that American jobs, American factories, and entire American industries would, in time, inevitably be outsourced or shipped abroad. Because when your currency assumes the role of the world's reserve currency, your domestic economy often transforms into a tool for global stability, rather than prioritizing national prosperity. The astute economists at Bretton Woods were, in fact, well aware of this inherent contradiction. It is known as the Triffin dilemma, named after the Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin, who meticulously articulated it in 1959. To provide the world with the necessary liquidity in dollars, America must run deficits. Yet, running deficits indefinitely fundamentally undermines global confidence in the dollar's value. It is an impossible contradiction, destined to eventually break the system. But in 1944, none of these long-term concerns truly mattered. America was at its zenith. The world desperately needed dollars. And, crucially, the vast gold reserves in Fort Knox appeared to guarantee those dollars would retain their value. For a significant period, the system functioned beautifully. Europe meticulously rebuilt. Japan likewise recovered. International trade exploded, leading to an unprecedented era of globalization. The global economy entered what would become the longest sustained boom in modern history. And America, naturally, profited handsomely from every single transaction, because every transaction relied on dollars. American banks financed the world. American corporations expanded aggressively into every conceivable market. American culture, American products, and American power spread ubiquitously. This was undeniably the American century, and it was firmly built upon the foundations meticulously laid at Bretton Woods. Yet, as the Triffin dilemma foretold, the system harbored a fatal flaw. America consistently printed more dollars than it possessed gold to legitimately cover. In 1944, the ratio was solid and reassuring. However, by the 1960s, this backing was increasingly becoming a facade, a transparent lie, and the world began to take notice. France was the first nation to audaciously call America's bluff. Charles de Gaulle, the formidable president of France, meticulously scrutinized the figures and realized, with mounting alarm, that America was systematically cheating. The U.S. was spending colossal amounts on the Vietnam War, on ambitious domestic social programs, and on maintaining an extensive network of military bases across the globe, all funded by simply printing more dollars. But those dollars were supposed to be backed by gold, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that the gold simply wasn't there. In 1965, de Gaulle issued a directive to the Banque de France, immediately begin converting its dollar holdings into gold. He famously dispatched ships across the Atlantic to repatriate France's gold reserves back to Paris. Other countries, observing this bold move, began to follow suit. Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, all began demanding gold in exchange for their accumulated dollars. The gold was rapidly flowing out of Fort Knox. America was confronted with an inescapable choice: either cease its profligate spending or renege on the solemn promise made at Bretton Woods. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made the momentous decision. He publicly announced that the United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold. The gold window was decisively closed. The Bretton Woods system was effectively dead, and the dollar became a purely fiat currency, backed by nothing more than the government's word and its perceived power. This was the precise moment when everything irrevocably changed. For 27 years, the dollar was considered as good as gold because it was explicitly backed by gold. After 1971, it was backed by nothing concrete, merely trust, merely the promise that America would remain powerful enough, stable enough, for the world to continue using dollars even without the tangible gold guarantee. And for the subsequent 50 years, remarkably, that is precisely what transpired. Because by 1971, the entire global system was so intricately built upon dollars that abandoning the currency would have meant abandoning the entire intricate structure of global trade. So, the world remained ensnared within the system, even after the gold had vanished, even after the promise had been broken. But here is the profound consequence for you, the individual. Without the discipline of gold backing, governments could print virtually unlimited amounts of money. And they did. Inflation exploded. Throughout the 1970s, prices dramatically doubled. Savings were systematically destroyed. Wages stagnated, failing to keep pace. And the purchasing power of the dollar embarked on a death spiral that, arguably, continues to this very day. Your grandfather might have purchased a house in 1964, say, $20,000. That identical house today could easily cost $400,000. Did the house fundamentally improve 20-fold? No. Did your salary increase proportionally to match this staggering rise? Almost certainly not. The dollar simply became increasingly worthless. And it became worthless due to pivotal decisions made, first at Bretton Woods in 1944, and then, crucially, in August 1971. Let us make this painfully, unambiguously clear. In 1944, the average American worker earned approximately $2,000 per year. The median home price was around $5,000, representing about 2.5 times their annual salary. Today, the median income is approximately $75,000. The median home price, however, now exceeds $400,000, more than 5 times your annual salary. Your grandparents could, astonishingly, acquire a house on a single income within a few short years. You, in stark contrast, often cannot. This is not because houses are inherently better or more expensive to build. It is because the money itself is fundamentally broken. And the money is broken because the system originally created at Bretton Woods was meticulously designed to benefit America at the direct expense of everyone else. And when that system inevitably fractured in 1971, it was not fixed, but rather redesigned again. This time to benefit the select few who control the money, once more at the expense of everyone else. You, the ordinary citizen, were never truly part of the grand plan. Here's the crucial part they don't teach you in school. Bretton Woods was never truly about fostering stability or universal prosperity for ordinary people. It was, from its very core, about control. Control of global trade, control of national currencies, control of entire economies. The men who gathered in that room in 1944 were not elected representatives. Most people have never even heard their names. Yet, they designed a system that fundamentally dictated whether your country could trade, whether your currency retained its value, and whether your economy would flourish or catastrophically collapse. And they designed it, quite deliberately, to benefit themselves and their respective powers. America secured reserve currency status, granting it unparalleled influence. Wall Street gained the lucrative privilege of financing the world, and everyone else was relegated to a state of dependency. When the system finally crumbled in 1971, it was not replaced with something better or more equitable. It was replaced with something demonstrably worse, a purely fiat currency system, devoid of any gold backing, any inherent discipline, or any meaningful limits. Just endless printing, resulting in endless inflation, which in turn facilitates an endless transfer of wealth from hardworking individuals to those who hold vast assets. Today, we are living through what could be described as the endgame of Bretton Woods. The dollar technically remains the world's reserve currency, but its long-held dominance is visibly weakening. China, Russia, India, they are all actively striving to construct viable alternatives. They are increasingly trading in their own national currencies. They are aggressively buying gold by the thousands of tons. They are creating new payment systems that deliberately bypass the dollar, because they understand what you, too, need to grasp. This system is dying. It is dying because it is predicated on an astronomical debt that can, quite literally, never be repaid. It is dying because fundamental trust is breaking down. It is dying because the underlying economic maths simply no longer works. And when it finally, inevitably collapses, the people who will suffer most profoundly are those holding paper assets, dollars, bonds, bank accounts, all of it backed by nothing more than the increasingly fragile promise of a government drowning in its own debt. The people who will truly survive and potentially thrive are those holding tangible, real assets, gold, land, essential resources, valuable skills. Because when the paper system eventually fails, and fail it will, reality is the only thing that ultimately matters. History repeatedly demonstrates this recurring pattern. Bretton Woods initially created an empire of paper built upon a foundation of gold. When the gold was removed, that paper became a lie, and lies, without exception, always collapse. The only remaining question is precisely when. So, what crucial lessons should you take from this historical journey? First, truly understand that the economic system you currently inhabit was meticulously designed in 1944 by individuals long since deceased, operating within a world that no longer exists, and aiming to solve problems you yourself do not face. Yet, it persists, primarily because it continues to benefit the powerful few who control it. Second, recognize that money is not what you fundamentally perceive it to be. It is not intrinsic value. It is merely a claim on value. And that claim can be systematically inflated away, drastically devalued, or entirely erased whenever those in charge deem it convenient. Third, prepare assiduously for the next financial reset, because it is undeniably coming. The global debt is utterly unsustainable. Inflation is accelerating at an alarming rate. Trust in institutions is rapidly eroding. And when the dollar finally loses its long-held reserve status, when the system originally designed at Bretton Woods ultimately expires, you absolutely do not want to be caught holding nothing but paper. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, educate yourself. Read extensively about Bretton Woods. Research the complexities of fiat currency. Learn about what invariably happens when paper money ultimately dies. Because it has happened before, countless times throughout history, and the people who possess the foresight to anticipate these shifts are often the ones who successfully navigate and survive them. History may not repeat itself precisely, but its underlying patterns are undeniably unmistakable. In 1944, world leaders convened and dictated how your money would function. They chose a system that undeniably enriched America while, in many respects, impoverishing everyone else. In 1971, that system fractured, and instead of genuinely fixing it, they compounded the problem, making it demonstrably worse. And now, 80 years later, you are living directly with the profound consequences. You may struggle to afford a house. You may find retirement an increasingly distant dream. You may find saving money an insurmountable challenge. This is not because you are personally failing. It is because the entire game was rigged in 1944 and nobody ever bothered to explain the rules to you. Bretton Woods was not a conference dedicated to cooperation or shared global stability. It was, from start to finish, about unwavering control. And the powerful individuals who seize that control have never truly relinquished it. They merely adapted the mechanisms, shifting from gold-backed dollars to pure fiat currency, from fixed exchange rates to volatile, floating chaos, from financial discipline to seemingly endless printing. And throughout it all, you have been consistently told that this is simply normal, that this is how money works. But it is not. It is, more accurately, how systemic theft works. If this analysis has provided you with a fresh perspective, please consider subscribing. History holds the answers, and I shall endeavor to show you precisely where to look.